For 3 years, since June 11, 1962, when Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin vanished from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, law enforcement officials have maintained the same official story. 3 desperate inmates, executing a brilliant solo escape using improvised tools and a homemade raft, only to perish in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. The FBI searched for bodies, investigated countless leads, interrogated hundreds of witnesses, and spent millions of dollars trying to determine what happened that night. But they were asking the wrong questions, looking in the wrong places, completely missing the real story of what happened at Alcatraz between 1954 and 1963, a story that had nothing to do with 3 men acting alone, and everything to do with one man's quiet, strategic brilliance. A man who built influence where power shouldn't exist, who created respect where brutality ruled, and made the impossible escape possible through methods so subtle even the guards never understood what was happening right in front of them. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Alcatraz on April 3, 1954, transferred from Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, where he had been serving a 10-year sentence for narcotics conspiracy. At 48 years old, he was already legendary in criminal circles. The man who controlled Harlem's policy gambling operations, who had fought Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano for territory, who built a $20 million empire despite starting life in desperate poverty in South Carolina. But federal prosecutors had finally found charges that stuck. Conspiracy to distribute heroin in interstate commerce, a charge Johnson always claimed was fabricated by FBI agents who couldn't make anything else stick, but who were determined to remove him from Harlem by any means necessary. When officials discovered he was still running his operations from inside prison through coded letters and corrupt guards, they decided to send him to the one prison designed to crush inmates who couldn't be controlled in regular federal facilities: Alcatraz, the isolated fortress in San Francisco Bay, where surveillance and restrictions were supposed to make outside influence impossible. The Bureau of Prisons believed Alcatraz would break him. That constant isolation, censored mail, limited visitation, and guards watching every move would finally shut down his operations. But they didn't understand Bumpy Johnson. The harder you make something, the more creative and strategic he becomes. Alcatraz didn't break Bumpy. It gave him a new challenge, and Bumpy loved challenges. During his first weeks, he observed carefully, said little, learned the rules, mapped the system, before attempting to work within it or around it. He walked the yard quietly during recreation periods, sat in the dining hall without complaint, worked his assigned job in the prison laundry, and projected the image of a man who intended to serve his time peacefully, without causing trouble. According to former inmates, during those first weeks, most men didn't even notice him. Robert "Red" Henderson, who served at Alcatraz from 1953 to 1962, said, "He was just another new inmate, middle-aged black guy, quiet, polite to guards, didn't start any trouble. The only thing that stood out was his intelligence, smarter than most inmates, smarter than most guards. He read constantly, played chess better than anyone I'd ever seen, carried himself with dignity even though guards treated all of us like animals. But he didn't try to assert himself at first. He was learning, watching, figuring out who had power, how power worked, where vulnerabilities were." What Bumpy observed during those first weeks was a prison defined by brutality and arbitrary authority. Guards at Alcatraz in the 1950s enforced rules through violence, threw men into solitary confinement for minor infractions, humiliated prisoners deliberately to break their spirits and establish dominance. The worst part was guards rotated frequently, working Alcatraz for a year or two and then transferring, so inmates couldn't build relationships, couldn't reason with them, couldn't appeal to any sense of fairness, because guards didn't care. They wanted control through fear. And in that environment, where traditional power depended on violence, Johnson realized a completely different approach was required. He began developing a strategy that would eventually give him more influence than anyone except perhaps the warden himself. In May 1965, True Crime Chronicles interviewed 17 former Alcatraz inmates who had served time with Johnson between 1954 and 1963. Men who watched him operate every day, men who understood the systems he built, and men who were finally speaking because the prison had closed, because Johnson was no longer incarcerated, and because they believed the legend deserved to be told properly, not distorted by speculation or misinformation. What emerges from these interviews is a portrait of criminal genius operating at the highest level under the most constrained circumstances imaginable. A man who transformed powerlessness into power, isolation into connection, and imprisonment into opportunity, not through violence, not through intimidation, but through intelligence, respect, and the patient accumulation of influence that made people want to help him instead of fearing him. Men who feared authority still followed his guidance. Men who respected him trusted his judgment, and every decision he made was calculated to extend influence quietly, so subtly that few outside the prison walls ever understood the reach of his operations. Bumpy Johnson was not just surviving Alcatraz. He was controlling it in ways the officials could never detect, and setting the stage for events that would ultimately change the course of prison history. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, better known as Bumpy Johnson, was already legendary long before he ever saw Alcatraz. Born in South Carolina in 1905 and raised in Harlem, Bumpy came up during one of the most violent eras in American criminal history. He wasn't some reckless street thug. He was a strategist, a chess player, a reader, a man who understood power long before most men understood fear. By the 1930s and 40s, Bumpy controlled Harlem's policy gambling operations, the underground lottery that brought in millions every year. He went toe-to-toe with Dutch Schultz, outmaneuvered Lucky Luciano, and built a criminal empire worth over $20 million in Depression-era money, while still maintaining loyalty from Harlem residents who saw him as both protector and provider. But the FBI couldn't tolerate that. They tried everything: wiretaps, informants, fabricated charges, and finally, they got him. In 1954, Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 10 years for narcotics conspiracy, a charge he always claimed was invented by agents who couldn't make anything else stick. And when authorities discovered he was still running Harlem from inside prison, they sent him to the one place designed to crush men like him: Alcatraz, the island fortress where isolation, constant surveillance, and harsh guards were supposed to make it impossible for any inmate to wield influence. A place where power, in theory, was stripped from every man. But Bumpy Johnson had other plans. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on April 3, 1954, transferred from Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas, where he'd been serving his sentence. At 48 years old, he was already feared, already respected, already dangerous, not because he fought, but because he thought. Officials classified him as a high-risk inmate after discovering he was still managing Harlem operations through coded letters and corrupt guards, still resolving disputes, still moving money, still giving orders from 2,500 miles away. The Bureau of Prisons decided enough was enough. Their solution? Send him to Alcatraz, the prison designed to isolate inmates completely from the outside world. No communication, no corruption, no influence, or so they thought. Marcus Williams, who served at Alcatraz from 1952 to 1961, later said, "They sent Bumpy to Alcatraz thinking it would break him, thinking isolation would shut him down, but they didn't understand Bumpy. The harder you made something, the more creative and strategic he became." Alcatraz didn't break Bumpy Johnson, it gave him a challenge, and Bumpy loved challenges. From the moment he stepped onto the island, he began quietly observing, learning the routines, watching the guards, understanding the inmates, mapping every opportunity, and planning how a man who was supposed to be powerless could quietly become untouchable. Johnson's first weeks at Alcatraz were spent doing what he always did: watching, listening, learning. He walked the yard quietly, worked his laundry duty, spoke respectfully to guards, read constantly, played chess, didn't cause trouble, didn't threaten anyone, didn't try to dominate. Robert Red Henderson, who served from 1953 to 1962, said, "Bumpy's first month, most of us didn't even notice him. Just another quiet, middle-aged guy, polite to guards, never started anything. But you could tell he was smarter than everyone in the room." And that was intentional, because while other inmates tried to establish dominance through violence, Bumpy was mapping the system, learning who had power, how rules were enforced, where weaknesses lived, which guards were strict, which were flexible, which inmates were respected, which were feared, which were desperate, which were loyal. He wasn't rushing. He was building something, something bigger than himself, something no one inside Alcatraz, and no one on the outside, could yet understand. A network of influence, a web of respect, and a level of control that would eventually allow him to manipulate events that most thought were impossible. Alcatraz in the 1950s wasn't just a prison. It was psychological warfare. Guards enforced rules through humiliation, beatings, solitary confinement for weeks over minor violations. Inmates were stripped of dignity, stripped of humanity, and stripped of hope. James Huey Wheeler, who served from 1954 to 1960, said, "The guards were animals. They'd hit you for looking at them wrong, tear up your cell for no reason, throw you in the hole over nothing. There was no respect, no dignity, and worse. Guards rotated constantly, so you couldn't build relationships, couldn't appeal to fairness, couldn't negotiate. Power came from fear, or so everyone thought. But Bumpy Johnson saw something else. He saw a system built on intimidation, which meant it was fragile, because fear creates enemies, and enemies look for revenge. But respect creates loyalty, and loyalty creates power, and loyalty is far more reliable than fear, far more effective, because people who respect you want to help you, instead of plotting against you. And that understanding became the foundation of Bumpy's strategy inside Alcatraz.